In this slide, I have to talk very slow. I remember attending a talk by Langlands not long after I began working in representation theory. Langlands began his talk like this, quote, "There was a time, not long ago, and I remember it very well, when there was no discrete series," unquote. There are many who have had a long association with Harish Chandra through personal association. They give a breathtaking view of the wide, dazzling canvas, which paints with uncanny brushing skills. Harish Chandra's range of mathematical foresight and talent, the ambitious heights he knew he had to reach, which needed him to climb solo every mountain, as in the lyrics of a famous Broadway musical, to follow every rainbow till he reached his dream goals, a dream that will need stretching to the limit all the formidable powers only a once-in-a-millennium Harish Chandra can give, to ensure a brighter day on the other side to every representation theorist. I will soon tell you, without too much technical details, what the character of a representation is and what the formidable difficulties are. But first let me read out what V.S. Varadarajan says. Quote, "In my opinion, the character problem and the problem of construction of the discrete series were the ones that defined him by stretching his formidable powers to their limit. The Harish Chandra formula for the characters of the discrete series is the single most beautiful formula in the theory of infinite dimensional unitary representations." Varadarajan further says that the technical difficulties caused him extreme frustration and nervous breakdown and depression. Harish Chandra's own words to an embassy audience. Around 1925, Hermann Weyl extended the work of Reminiscence to compact groups and discovered a beautiful formula which is now called the Weyl character formula. It eventually became possible to prove an analog of Weyl's formula for all semi-simple groups and extend to them the theory of Fourier transforms.
Binary work is often clumsy and not perfectly put together even at the highest level. This is not true in this case. The papers developing the theory of characters and the construction of the discrete series was used to interpret the line of attack clear from beginning to finish.
The manuscripts of these papers of Harish Chandra have unbelievably few corrections in them. He obviously knew in his mind how they go. Harish Chandra first came to the United States as an assistant to Paul Dirac. Later, Harish Chandra took up an offer at Columbia University. At the same time, yes, Helgeson had an offer elsewhere, but he preferred spending 1 year at Columbia University just to be with Harish Chandra because he had read his papers and he was impressed quite a bit. Helgeson would often visit Harish Chandra and he continued to do so even after Harish Chandra moved to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In a memorial talk after Harish Chandra passed away, Helgeson says, "The cumulative nature of this work of Harish Chandra spanning 25 years or more leads one to characterize it as monumental. Yet even this does not do justice to the courage and pioneering efforts, both conceptual and technical, needed to overcome the formidable obstacles along the way." Harish Chandra and Mrs. Harish Chandra often used to host Helgeson in their apartment. Helgeson says, "I still remember a tiny desk in that apartment next to the kitchenette and found out in amazement that in this ungainly workspace he had actually written these long, magnificent papers This tiny desk always symbolizes for me the ascetic discipline of Harish Chandra's work.
Harish Chandra's career as a physicist was to be brief. 2 years in Bangalore with Baba and 2 years in Cambridge with Paul Dirac. His thesis, the classification of irreducible representations of the Lorentz group. It was proposed by Dirac, and that is how he got started in group representations. They were to be his life. The academic year 1952-53 he spent in Bombay at the Tata Institute, returning also to Bangalore where he was met at the airport by Sir C.V. Raman, but that is where he found his life partner too. I had the good fortune to get exposed to some of Harish Chandra's celebrated work through the work of Narasimha and Okamoto.
An oft-quoted view of Harish Chandra expressed during a conference in honor of Dirac. I have often pondered over the roles of knowledge or experience on the one hand and imagination or intuition on the other in the process of discovery. I believe that there is a certain fundamental conflict between the two. Knowledge, by advocating caution, tends to inhibit the flight of imagination. Therefore, a certain naivete, unburdened by conventional wisdom, can sometimes be a positive asset.
He was a tall, handsome man who was somewhat reserved, but who possessed a formal courtesy that did not conceal the depth of his feelings and thought. In his early years, he liked to paint and later expressed a fondness for the French Impressionists. One of his colleagues suggested that Harish Chandra survives in his work, which faithfully mirrored his personality, intense, lofty, and uncompromising.
In the summer of 1972, there was an AMS meeting on homogeneous spaces in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Harish Chandra was present. B.S. Varadarajan spoke on the work of Harish Chandra in a series of about 6 lectures, I think. Incidentally, many young researchers at the meeting quipped, Harish Chandra is the prophet and V.S. Varadarajan is the Messiah. But Harish Chandra himself told Varadarajan, I felt like a composer sitting before a conductor. Harish and Lily stayed at a nearby hotel, and Henderson writes in a recollection, I still remember the large green field on which they walked over to the campus the first morning. With her colorful sari, they really looked like a regal couple.
But Professor Premi Chandra said in the beginning that Harish would have been thrilled that all of us are here, and I'm thrilled myself here. And I'm saying this way.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure talking to you all. I want to end this presentation by showing you this short clip from a poem, If, by Rudyard Kipling. The second line, walk with kings, not losing my common touch, is what appeals to me, to feel grateful to the organizers of this conference and workshop. For from the day of your invitation to me, I was feeling thrilled walking hand in hand with the King of Kings. Thank you very much for this pleasant duty.
Thank you very much. So I now request Professor Raghunathan to come and share his experiences.
suppose I'm the oldest guy around here and has known Harish Chandra for the longest time, except for his family. Except for his family, there's no question. Well, I first heard about Harish Chandra when I joined the Tata Institute. He was, of course, already known and hailed as the greatest mathematician of Ramanujan in India, from India. And this was 1960. Not yet discrete series, but not yet discrete series had not yet appeared on the scene, I think, or maybe I'm wrong. 1960, right? Well, okay, that's when I joined the institute and I first heard of Harish Chandra. And the first time I met him was in 1964, when he had come to Bombay and had visited the Tata Institute. Met him, probably is not the right word, because a number of our students hung around and shook hands with him. And that's about all. So, and then we watched more senior people talking to him. Of course, we looked up to him in awe because of all that we heard about him. And that during that visit, already something happened, which is some interest, I guess. Two of my colleagues, Harish Chandra had asked two of my colleagues to go to Princeton, to the Institute for Advanced Studies members. And this caused a certain amount of problem because Harish Chandra had done it over the head of the boss of the department, Chandra. Chandra didn't like it. And I think that and some earlier contacts with Chandra did not leave a good impression of him on Harish Chandra. And I'll say a few words about it a little later. Anyway, in my first real meeting with Harish Chandra happened in 1966 when I was visiting at the Institute for Advanced Study. And soon after I came to Princeton, I met him, and it was a very pleasant meeting. He came, we were introduced, and immediately, actually, I don't know if anybody else introduced. I just walked up to him and introduced myself, and he said, "Yes, I've heard about you from Borel. He tells me that you proved some interesting things, but I don't understand his home watching." That was the first thing. Of course, my day was made when someone like Harish Chandra says that he had heard good things about me from the what do I call him, high priest of discrete groups at that time, Homoji at that time, Borel, because it was a wonderful day for me. I was on cloud 9, you can say. And during that year, I would often on see him, but I never really talked mathematics to him. I was much too scared to talk mathematics to him because of all of that, and I was myself interested in something else which did not interest him, obviously. And we talked about various things, sometimes about the Tata Institute, and when he made it clear that he thought poorly of Chandra and also Baba. This was I was kind of nervous on those occasions because I come with a fairly high opinion of Baba and Chandra, and here was, of course, I had some reservations about Chandra because my personal contacts with him were not all that pleasant, but Harish Chandra said things about Chandra, I was a little taken aback. Anyway, and as I said, I had not many personal meetings with him. There are far and few between. I attended a course of lectures he gave on automorphic forms that year. And there's some amusing things happened during those lectures. On one occasion, he said, he stated some result and was beginning to prove it, and then interrupted and said, Langdon says it follows from some work, some Ascoli-Arjuna theorem. Have you people heard of Ascoli-Arjuna theorem? This was his comment. Of course, he could of course prove it with his own methods. But having been trained as a physicist, Ascoli-Arjuna theorem, which usually comes up in an advanced undergraduate course, was not known to him. So he asked around, do people know this Ascoli-Arjuna theorem? That would be very, it amused many people. And the other occasion was, he was stated some lemma. There were two parts to the lemma. he was proving something. At some point, it went on for some time. At some point, he said, so that proves the first part. Borel was in the audience, said, my God, that's a trivial thing. Chandra was so visibly annoyed. He said, for some people, some things are trivial, for other people, other things are trivial. That was that. And another thing that happened which amused me, which had to do with Chandra, this was in 1966. Titz had come to give a lecture, and he was talking all the time about compact unipotent groups. Harish was looked puzzled, and at some point burst out and said, what do you mean compact unipotent groups? They're all trivial. And then Wade goes in this audience and says, Harish always thinks of the pathological case of real numbers. And everybody burst out laughing. And the amazing thing, 2 years later, the man was in the forefront of representations of PID groups. It shows it doesn't matter when you start learning something, you can pick up so fast and you can get to the forefront. So this was my experience in the Institute for Advanced Study. Of course, he invited me home, and I enjoyed the gracious hospitality of Julie, who I came to know somewhat better after Chandra passed away. When I was in Princeton, I went to the home just once for a dinner. I didn't really get to meet Lily much. Yeah. After that year in Princeton, I didn't get to meet him very much. It used to be far and few between. The next time I met him was in Bombay. He had come to India in 1972, and he spent a few days in Bombay. And when he gave some lectures, which I attended, my knowledge of representation theory was not very strong, but I did follow his lecture a little bit. And then later I met him in a completely different capacity. I was on a committee which was organizing a binational conference on mathematical education. Unfortunately, I seem to have got into these things fairly early, but I was at this meeting.
Maybe you should say Indo-US.
Yeah, the binational was India and US. There was a lot of money US had given to India which they couldn't get back. The loans which are not returnable, and so they decided to spend it on organizing meetings like this. In fact, there was a binational conference on physics, binational conference on mathematics. Practically every subject was a binational conference. And this meeting was held in Delhi, and I was in Delhi for the meeting. And the chairman of the committee said, I'm very happy to tell you that Professor Harish is in town, and he has kindly agreed to come and address us. And Professor Harish came there, and he said, well, he began the lecture. I'm afraid I'm going to be somewhat blunt. I hope you people will not be too upset too much. And then he says, there's only one place where worthwhile mathematics is going on in this country, and that is the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And I was the only person in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research who was there. And of course, when he said that, nobody would of course respond to that. Just kept quiet, and it was clear that some of them were very unhappy. Fortunately, he made up for it, but later on, blasted the Tata Institute for not helping the universities develop into good departments. That was the next time I met him. That was 1972. After that, again, there was a long gap, and I think I met him. He never came to India, and my visits to US were not by any means frequent. So the next time I was in, next time I met him was in Princeton. I had gone to give a talk at the Borel 60th birthday conference, and on the last day of the conference, or the next day, Harish Chandra hosted a lunch for many of us. I was there, present there, and we enjoyed the hospitality. And he was in really, what should I say, very cheerful and at his lively best. And of course, there was Lily, and there was a gracious hospitality. And it was a very happy occasion. But it turned out that evening he died. When he was going for a walk, apparently fell down and died. And Borel called me at something like midnight and told me his bad news, and also offered to take me to Chandra's place. I met Lily there that evening. That was the last meeting naturally. And these are my recollections, reminiscences. Unfortunately, I had no serious mathematical contact with him. That's really all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, I believe we have the time to play the message that Dr. Howard sent. It's a video message, and we will play it now.
So, my first memory of meeting Harish Chandra was at the Institute for Advanced Study in the fall of 1971. So he was obviously a permanent member there, and I had been working for 2 years at Stony Brook University, and it had really tired me out, so I thought I needed a break. I applied to the Institute to be a fellow for the year, and they accepted me. So there we went, and we were living on Outside Drive, and I thought, I had been reading Harish Chandra's papers. I've been trying to read them pretty seriously. They were hard. I mean, he doesn't waste time. It's theorem proof kind of thing. And some of the proofs are quite long. So anyway, I was eager to meet him. And at that time, the mathematicians were housed in, I think it was called Building B. If you were at Fulton Hall and you went out on the back porch and looked at, in back of Fulton Hall there was this huge lawn, and on the left-hand side there were a couple small brick buildings, and one of them was where the mathematicians had their offices. So I went there and knocked on his door and said hello and introduced myself. And he welcomed me in, and he was very welcoming. I always found Harish Chandra to be easy to talk to and kind of relaxing. It was not, he didn't stand on ceremony, didn't act like he was a big deal. He was always ready to talk with you in kind of a personal kind of a way. That said, it wasn't a huge conversationalist. He didn't always bring up a lot of topics. Sometimes you had to think of something, but he would respond readily if you did say something. So I went and introduced myself, and he invited me in, and we talked for a while. And he got a little bit philosophical. I guess this was 1971, so he was about to turn 50. Well, it would have been next year in the spring. And he was probably thinking about that, and he was thinking about, in Hinduism, you have these different ages, and after 60, you're old, but from 50 to 60, you can still do work. And anyway, he was certainly looking forward to doing work. And he had not too long before, he had completed his major project on real groups, on Lie groups. He had proven the Plancherel formula, and now he was turning his attention to p-adic groups, and that's what I had gotten interested in also. So anyway, we talked a little bit about that, and I don't remember how long that was, but anyway, it was a very nice introduction, and it had been, he had said some personal things about himself, and I just met him, and he definitely put me at ease. And after that, I guess the main times I saw him was during his lectures. He believed in lecturing. It was a way for him to think about the exposition of his results, and also to make sure that he understood, had all the details right. And so he believed it was kind of his duty. Here he was at the Institute for Advanced Study, didn't have to teach courses, he didn't have any formal students. So this was a way of kind of substituting for students, and also fulfilling what he thought of as some kind of obligation to propagate his work, to make sure that people understood what he was up to, and interact with it that way. And over the course of the year, we did have some mathematical interactions. Somewhat later in the year, he wanted to do for p-adic groups the kinds of things he had done for real groups. And a lot of that depended on understanding the characters of the representations. And one of his major results for characters on real groups was that they were locally integrable functions, that they weren't more complicated distributions than that. And he did that partly by induction from the discrete series, and partly because they were eigenfunctions for the center of the enveloping algebra, and he had strong control over the possible behavior of such eigenfunctions. So he wanted to somehow imitate that analysis for p-adic groups, and there are no differential equations on p-adic groups, so there's no chance of using that kind of toolbox to do what he wanted to do. So we talked about that off and on, and towards the end of the year, I had a couple ideas that I thought might be helpful, and I worked them out for GLN. And actually, the first time I told him about him, or the first time I described it, I was missing a fairly serious point, which later on he wrote me and said, could you sketch your argument? And so I started writing it down, and I realized that there was this error, and I had to scramble quite a bit to figure out how to fix it, but I did. And so I sent him my argument for GLN, and I later published that myself. And he then went on to do it in general, which was that was his modus operandi. He always wanted to treat the general case. He was not very interested in examples. So that was a really nice interaction. I was glad that I could provide some ideas that would help him out in his program. And so I should say that year at the Institute was also very nice because there was a group of us. There was Paul Sally was there. I'm sure you've heard his name. He was a very strong disciple of Harish Chandra, and several other people whose interests were group representations. And we would get together and we would also faithfully attend his lectures and get together afterwards and talk about them and make sure we tried to understand them. And but after that year, so I had to go back. I went back to Stony Brook, and then another nice thing about being at the Institute that year was that I met Jacques Titz, who was also visiting the Institute there, and our apartments were near each other, and I had to actually walk by past the Titz's apartment when I was on my way to Fall Hall, and they noticed me because sometimes I was whistling, and so I got to know Jacques Titz, and a year later he invited me to visit the Sonderforschungsbereich in Bonn, which was run by Hirzebruch. And so I went there, and that was also a very wonderful year for me. And one of the interesting and nice things about it was that Harish needed, so he was continuing to think about, carry out his program for pianic groups, and some things, for some groups, he knew that there was a maximal compact subgroup with very nice properties, and he needed some of those properties to make some of his arguments, but it wasn't clear to him that this was true in general. So he wrote to Titz and said, "What can you tell me about whether general groups have compact subgroups with these nice properties?" And Titz mentioned the problem to me, and we talked about it, and I realized that I could solve it under certain hypotheses. The basic thing was the multiplicative group of the field should be quite large. So when that was true, then you could find these good subgroups. And then Jacques Titz, who understood groups as schemes, figured out how he could turn that into a general result. So he communicated back to Harish Chandra, which again led Harish to complete another part of his program. So that was kind of a long distance interaction with Harish, but it was satisfying. Anyway, it further, I think it was another good part of our relationship. And after that, a little bit later, I went to Yale, and I got very busy, and I started having students, and I always thought I would go back to the Institute because I had had such a great time there, but I never did. But in 1982, Vardarajan and Paul Sally decided, in the late 80s, there was this huge exodus of mathematicians from Russia. And one of the traditions in Russia was to have these 60th birthday parties for their more eminent mathematicians. And so that kind of infected the US, and then Paul Sally and Vardarajan thought that there should be one for Harish Chandra, which I think was very appropriate, certainly. And so they started planning that, but then they realized, Bohr Ramel is almost the same age as Harish Chandra, but a little bit older. So they decided they needed to have a conference for Borel also, and since he was a little bit older, that should go first. And so there was a conference for Borel. It was more or less on the date of Harish's 60th birthday. It was kind of ironic that was how things worked out. And then Harish's conference was planned for the following spring. And, but that was a very nice conference, and Harish Chandra, he attended all the lectures quite faithfully, and after on a couple of different evenings after the evening lectures were over, people would, go up to him and ask him this question or that question, and they turned into quite long discussions, group discussions, of which Harish was the center, as the light was dimming and the sun was going down. He seemed to enjoy that quite well. He was very much at home. He was very like himself. He had definite opinions, but he didn't insist on them or pretend that they were the only things that people could say. And then, so that was really, that was wonderful, because at that time, he died right at the day after the Borel conference ended. And I remember getting Premi Chandra's message about that. It was just such a shock. But those conversations, those group conversations after the lectures for the Borel conference, was a very nice way to end the relationship, if it had to be that way. I guess that's most of what I have to say.
So maybe this is an appropriate time to end this Reminiscences session. We'll have a tea break for half an hour, and we'll meet again at, let's say, 5:15, shall we make it? 5:30 for a panel discussion anchored by Professor Raghunathan, and with participation by various